Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for everyone who loves to write. I'm Steph, your host, coming to you from the National Centre for Writing, our vibrant literature house right here in Norwich, a UNESCO City of Literature. Today we're thrilled to be joined by writer and storyteller Aniefiok Ekpoudom for an in-depth conversation about his debut book, Where We Come From, Rap, Home and Hope in Modern Britain. Neef sat down with cultural writer, editor and friend of the podcast, Josh Baines, to share insights into the journey of researching and crafting this powerful narrative non-fiction work, which delves into the social history of British rap. But before I hand things over to Josh and Neef, we're right in the thick of festive planning season, racing towards Christmas. And if you're anything like me, your gift list is still a work in progress. If there's a writer or aspiring author in your life, why not surprise them with an NCW Academy gift voucher this holiday season? It's a thoughtful way to fuel their creativity and their ambition. From half-day workshops in Norwich to 12-week online tutored courses, our NCW Academy programme offers a range of inspiring and empowering writing experiences. E-vouchers can be purchased anytime, even in those last-minute Christmas Eve scrambles, and delivered directly to your loved one's inbox. Visit nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk/gifts to find out more. But now, back to the main topic of today's episode and our conversation with Aniefiok Ekpoudom. Neef is a South London writer documenting British community and culture. His debut book, Where We Come From, was published by Faber this year. A journalist for outlets like The Guardian and GQ, his work blends narrative and cultural history. Featured in anthologies such as Safe and Keisha the Sket, he is a Forbes 30 Under 30 honoree and British Journalism Award winner. Together, Josh and Neef explore Neef's journey into writing and the inspiration behind focusing on music for his debut book. They delve into writing national and landmark stories, the art of transforming real-life events into vivid, immersive storytelling, and the intricacies of interviewing and reporting for narrative non-fiction. So without further ado, I will hand over to Aniefiok Ekpoudom in conversation with Josh Baines.
I'm Josh.
I'm Aniefiok, also known as Neef.
I have in front of me a copy of Where We Come From, Rap, Home and Hope in Modern Britain, your debut book, which I think is, an incredibly kind of timely and important piece of narrative nonfiction, which is largely what we're going to be discussing today. But for our listeners, who maybe haven't come across the book yet, would you mind kind of giving us an overview and an outline of the book?
No, thank you. So my first book, Where We Come From, Rap, Home and Hope in Modern Britain, is a social history of UK rap and grime, stretching from the 60s to present day. But I guess more so than that, it's, as you mentioned, like a work of narrative nonfiction that looks at the lives of varying people across that time period. And I guess looks at how their lives have shaped the music, but also looks at how their lives have been shaped by the music too. And in 3 different locations across the UK, South Wales, South London and West Midlands, I look to build a portrait of those regions and the people that inhabit them, and also looking at the role music has played in those regions and the history of the music in those places too, as well as what the future of the music looks like as well. And the vessel for all of that were these, I guess, really personal character studies almost of individuals living in these different places. In South Wales, there's a band called Asteroid Boys, and I follow kind of their rise and fall through the lives of 3 of their main members. In the West Midlands, it looks at an early pirate radio pioneer, Cecil Morris, and then picks up with, I guess, a music executive, Despa. And then in South London, I look at the late rapper Cadet, who was from Clapham/Croydon, and kind of tell the history of the music through his life and career, and then also through how his family attempted to celebrate his legacy thereafter.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Before we get into kind of, I guess, bigger questions about the structure of the book and your approach to narrative nonfiction, I'd kind of like to go back a bit, if you don't mind. Can you kind of tell me how you got into writing in the first place? I know that we were kind of writing for similar websites like Vice and those sort of things at a similar time period. How did you get into that world? I mean, how did you find the editors to approach? How did you start kind of honing your voice? What was your way into, for want of a better word, kind of content and the nicer phrase, journalism?
So my start actually started. So I went to the University of East Anglia, which is actually in Norwich, and there I was studying law. But from the offset, I realized I really didn't enjoy law. So I essentially started to find something I essentially went the complete other direction, wanted to find something that filled my time in a really interesting way whilst I was doing this degree that I really didn't like. And I kind of picked up writing in that time period. At first I was kind of journaling a bit, and then I was also writing about this music that I'd grown up listening to, which was UK rap and grime. And I always felt that the music wasn't necessarily, the commentary around the music didn't always reflect the impact that the music had on people who consumed it and people who lived with the music. And that was always kind of a wrong that I always felt like I wanted to write in that sense. So I started writing into that space. I also started writing about football a bit as well. But in terms of getting actually into journalism, when I left uni, I started working at a place called Link Up TV, which is like a music platform which centers a lot of the renaissance of British rap that I talk about in the book took place on that YouTube platform. So it's a YouTube platform now of millions and millions and millions and tens of millions of views, who knows how many, but they would essentially platform a lot of local artists, a lot of London artists, Birmingham artists, Manchester artists, and they had an editorial wing. So that was my first in terms of interviewing musicians, so whose music I was listening to and whose music I was interested in. And then from there I worked at SBTV, which is a similar platform, for about 18 months, founded by the late Jamal Edwards. And that was a really key time for me because that was the first place where I was allowed to write with complete freedom, and it really explored what does my writing voice look like. We kind of had carte blanche to like run the editorial platforms how we wanted. And so I really got to really get an insight into how do I like to express myself. And by that time I'd started to read a lot of fiction as well, and a bit of narrative nonfiction as well. And I could see that that's where like I felt like my voice felt most me, if that makes sense. And so I started doing pieces for SBTV where we'd spend a day with somebody in Manchester, or a day with somebody in Birmingham, or a day with somebody in South London. We spent a day with the South London rapper Gigs the day before his album came out. And I guess I would write these stories that would, I guess, essentially try to blend those other influences. So blend in that fictional influence more on a stylistic level, and then blend in narrative nonfiction, but by talking about this music and these communities that I love and that I've come from. So that was kind of my start. And then from there, that was around 2015, 2016 times. And the music in the UK was starting to take off more broadly. This is the era of like Skepta and Stormzy are becoming really huge musicians. And I guess as I was writing about the music, there became more opportunities to cover the music in places that maybe hadn't covered it with the depth before. So that's where I began writing for The Guardian and British GQ. And The Guardian's probably one of the key places in my writing journey so far, because not only did I get to profile a lot of these musicians for The Guardian, so from the likes of John Biega's not a musician, but like John Biega, Skepta, the Adenuga family, Nines, Heady One, I did so many profiles for them, but I think I really learned about how to write with context, how to write for an audience who maybe aren't as familiar with the music as I am. And I think also how to write quickly. I think that was quite an important thing. And then how to working with editors properly for the first time. A lot of that came from that time period there. So that was kind of like my introduction and I guess journey so far.
Were there any editors back then who were kind of, I guess, really influential on your voice, on your style? You know, it can be a difficult but ultimately very rewarding relationship when you build something up really, really great with an editor. Is there anyone in specific that you can think of that, kind of had a really kind of positive impact on your writing and your approach to writing?
Yeah, definitely. There's an editor, Robin, at Clash Magazine. And Clash Magazine was one of the early magazines that I wrote for. And he was really influential in that. Whenever I'd write a piece, so I did a lot of early pieces with him. We did a series called Tales from the Grime Generation, where I was interviewing a lot of kind of the elders of the grime scene, like Jammer and DWE and Dexplicit, who produced Pow. But then I was also living in London at the time. There was a new generation of artists coming of age, like Little Sims, Koji Radical, that time period. And I guess I was kind of front and center for the rise of those careers when they were doing like 100 cap venues, 200 cap venues and whatnot. So I started profiling a lot of those artists, but I had like this quite distinct style. And I remember asking him for advice about how to get better. And he'd give me great advice about how to actually nurture my writing. He wouldn't ever, I think especially writing in that kind of way, a frustration I'd often come across was that it would try to be limited because journalism is about information, and I do get that, and space is limited and whatnot. So word counts are limited. So I guess I'd always get a lot of feedback which would try to, I guess, make my style of writing a bit more uniform. And he was one of the exceptions where he would encourage me, but then he would also give me like really pointed feedback. I always remember one thing he told me was that your descriptions of scenery are really strong, but you need to really make people feel like they're in the room as well. So it's not just about describing externally what's going on, but how does it feel to be inside a place? That was a really big piece of advice for me, and it's something I took on massively. So yeah, definitely Robin at Clash, I would say.
Lovely, thank you. There's one last one on this kind of section around the early days and your route into journalism. Do you think now, especially in the last few years when we've seen many kind of publications shrink in size or vanish completely, do you think it's increasingly difficult for younger writers, especially those who want to work in kind of music criticism and cultural criticism at large? Is it harder to find that starting place these days, do you think?
I think maybe not harder to find the starting place, but then harder to find the spaces that are almost in the middle that will allow you to have an income. Because I think a lot of those starting spaces are still there, and a lot of the magazines I wrote for are still there. Like Clash magazine is still there, Notion magazine is still there. There are numerous others now that are still there, but I think it's almost that leap afterwards that when you want to start, if you were trying to attempt to make some kind of living from it, I think that's where things have become tighter. I think a lot before they used to play, I guess like Vice was there, Noisy was there. These were all places that paid people a wage to do this essentially. And I think the shrinking of those spaces has been probably the most alarming thing, because I think then if you look after that, GQ and Vogue and whatnot, the New York and New York Times, those places are still there and a lot of them still play relatively well. But I think it's that middling stage for people to actually get to, even to have the patience to be able to stick out and get to those places after, I think is where there is a bit of an issue. And I think also just the creative industries in general, like I know myself, like I freelance, but I don't do music journalism as my full-time thing. I do other things alongside my freelance work, and every freelance writer, author I know pretty much does that. So I think definitely the nature of it has changed, and you maybe have to balance a few more things to allow you to write with freedom in that sense as well. So I would say that's definitely been a big thing that's shifted, and something that I think a lot of people are still figuring out, like how do I balance all of these things alongside pursuing a writing career, and what does a writing career look like, say in this age, and how is it different from back then? And I guess there are new avenues like podcasts and stuff that people explore too. So I think it's a challenging time, but also like an exciting time to, I guess, explore your creativity in that way.
Fantastic. And if I can put you on the spot, who are some of your favorite kind of music journalists, kind of contemporary, and then, kind of the bigger influences?
My favorite music journalist. Interesting. The funny thing is I don't read that much music journalism. That's the funny. It's a weird thing considering the book I've written, but I think it probably makes sense when I've started to explain like the influences of my work. I think I read a lot of creative nonfiction, a lot of narrative nonfiction, and I think that's probably been the biggest. That's more so the family I feel like I'm part of when it comes to a literary sense, if that makes sense. So I guess like historically, there's journalists and authors like Gay Talese, who wrote for the New York Times, and he did a famous like Frank Sinatra profile. He was part of the new journalism movement with like the likes of Joan Didion, who's probably my favorite writer, I would say. So I think they had big influences on me, where you could directly see in their work that they were trying to really tell stories, and there was a structure behind it, and they were quite meticulous about that. But then also you could tell, like, you could see the real flair and rhythm that they wrote with. That is something I'm always looking for when it comes to literature, is rhythm and cadence, and bringing that into a space where you're talking about real people and real lives and everyday reality in that sense. So they were really big influences on me. And then a lot of American sports writers, I would say, were and are big influences. So there's a journalist called Wright Thompson who has written a few books now, and he, I guess, became most well known for his long reads with ESPN. He did like famous Michael Jordan profiles, but he did some beautiful pieces about Hurricane Katrina, all of these different things. So I feel like American sports writing has, I guess, that real blend, or I guess had anyway, that real blend of using something as big as sport and as personal as sport to really as a vessel to really talk about the everyday human experience. So you could use basketball to talk about the collective human experience. You could use American football. You could use ice hockey. I'm not even interested in ice hockey, but I'd still read the pieces. There was another guy in that realm called Gary Smith, who wrote a lot for Esquire back in the day as well. So those would be my favorite. And then I guess probably the most, I'm not sure if he would describe himself as a music journalist, but Hanif Abdurraqib, who wrote A Little Devil in America. I think that was probably the one music related book I read and was influenced by when writing Where We Come From. And I guess he is a poet, essentially. That's what he was doing before a lot of anything else. So I think he brought poetry into that space, and you can see it in the way that he writes. It's like really beautiful, the way he crafts and molds words together, but then in some of his books anyway, uses that as a vessel to talk about the role music plays in our everyday lives. His book, A Little Devil in America, is, I think, one of the best books written in the last 10 years or so.
Amazing. I actually want to pick up on something there, because something that I loved as a reader with your book was the thoroughness of the kind of bibliography, because it serves two purposes. It isn't just the traditional, here are the sources cited in this text. It felt more like a syllabus for readers. And I thought that was a really fantastic way to present those things. It's made me want to reach out and, read more by authors I maybe hadn't come across before. So that's fantastic. But with that, you separate it into separate sections. And the one I want to think about today is the specific thing around narrative nonfiction. So can we just start by kind of outlining what your definition of that term is, how you approach that, how you think about narrative nonfiction?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, this is the kind of conversations I love to have. So to me, I think narrative nonfiction, I think, is at its core, it's nonfiction. I think that is the important part that you can't forget. Like, these stories are real and they happen and they have to be fact checked rigorously. But at its core, you aren't just displaying the facts or conveying information in the way I guess traditional journalism does need to do as well. So it's not a knock on that at all. You're not just conveying the information or displaying the facts. You're looking to tell and carve a wider story and narrative out of these individuals' lives or out of somebody's specific life. So I think that's where the influence from fiction comes from, where you're then bringing in the structure, but the flares, the tools that fiction writers use to, I guess, elevate and bring color into these real life events that have happened. So that's how I always see narrative nonfiction, is it might be historical events, it might be a current event, and carving a narrative out of it to tell a fully immersive, colourful, rigorous, but ultimately true story and a true account of what's happened in a specific place in a specific time period.
Fantastic. And with some of those writers, let's use Gator Lees as a good example, right? You referenced a minute ago his kind of legendary, almost mythical essay, Frank Sinatra Has a Cold, which is, again, as you pointed out, is one of the kind of foundational texts of new journalism and the American approach of new journalism. What is it specifically about an essay, an article like that really kind of pulled you in initially as a reader? Was it, as you said, it was doing very interesting different things with the classic journalistic profile, but was there anything about the style that kind of sang to you and kind of made you think, right, this is a mode of writing that feels incredibly, energizing or exciting to me, and I kind of want to learn from that?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a few things there. I think a lot of writing is about instinct. So I think there are certain writers you're going to be drawn to. You may not know why, and there are going to be certain writers that you're not drawn to. And I think when you find yourself drawn to somebody, I think it's always important to kind of follow that thread as much as you can. So I remember picking up Gator Lees when I picked up the new journalism and reading the Frank Sinatra profile. And I think I'm reading just a lot of his other work. The thing that really stood out to me was I think he had a very specific style that he wrote with. And I found interesting how, even though he's pretty much always absent from his stories, he would still impose his identity and sense of self on the page without him actually being there. And then I think, he has a really lyrical style that he writes with. And I think that is ultimately what drew me in. I think, especially being a fan of music and being a fan of rap, I think part of it comes from that. I think I'm always looking and I'm always drawn, even when it comes to rap and hip hop, I'm drawn to artists who are able to rhythmically and lyrically tell me about their most interior thoughts, or tell me about a specific place to the point that it feels real. And I think I'm always looking for the same when it comes to literature. And I think somebody like Gator Lees' work did that perfectly. He has this profile of the late Peter O'Toole, who was an Irish actor, and probably one of my favorite pieces of writing ever, when he describes being on the plane from London, flying over the channel across to Dublin. And the way he describes the scenery of Ireland, the hills, the farms as they're landing. And then he spends a day with Peter O'Toole going through all of these different places across Dublin, from the horse racing through to like his old family homes, his like ancestral homes in Ireland and whatnot. And it was so beautiful to read, but so evocative to read at the same time. And I think that is what really drew me in. And it was pieces of writing that I continually go back to. I think the same with Joan Didion, the way she wrote about Sacramento and where she was from, but also the mentalities and the ideas of the people who lived there, but was able to deliver it in a way that felt fictional in that sense, I think is definitely what draws me to that kind of writing, and what I was, I guess, trying to, do a similar thing in my book.
Yeah, and I feel there's something I kind of want to follow up on that with, around maybe an idea that we could term as like authorial imposition, right? You're really right. With Gator Lee's, the voice is so clear, but the person, he's not imposing himself on the subject of the profile, but he's implicitly there. Whereas Didion, I think, is a far more present figure in her pieces. And I think with where we come from, my reading is you kind of veered more towards the Gator Lee side. I don't feel that you're not trying to make yourself a kind of, a central protagonist of the book. Was that something you were conscious of doing, that your role was to tell the stories in South London, in South Wales, in the kind of West Midlands, without kind of, imposing yourself?
Yeah, definitely. I was trying to keep myself out of the stories as much as possible. And I wanted to put the lives front and center, essentially. And I think it's also just realizing what was the best way to tell this story. Because there are going to be some stories, and I've written essays before where I am front and center. So always try and let the writing lead and the story lead. And if the story calls for me to be a part of it, then I'll weave myself in. But if it doesn't, which I don't think it needed to in this book, I largely tried to keep myself absent. And I think a lot of the influences on, and I think I list some of them in the bibliography, where I was reading a lot of books that essentially see people render a community on the page and then look at 5 or 6 individual lives within those spaces. So there's an author called David Finkel who wrote a book called Thank You for Your Service, and that essentially follows like a platoon of servicemen who just came home from serving in Afghanistan in America. They're American soldiers and they just came home from Afghanistan, and the book traces like what happens to their individual lives in the years that follow war, essentially. And some are dealing with PTSD, some go back to normal family life, some don't, some are passed away, and it looks at how their family then recover from that or attempt to recover from that. I read another book, Behind the Beautiful Forevers, by Catherine Boo, which is based in the slums of Mumbai, and she follows like a family and a few families as like they navigate, I guess, Mumbai's changing nature against like globalization and whatnot. So I was reading books that specifically dissected a certain region and then looked at the lives of the people within those regions. And I just felt that for me, trying to do similar with my book, I definitely didn't need to be in the book, and that the lives were the most important thing to speak about. And I think also a big part of it was, I feel like narrative nonfiction obviously isn't as common in the UK. But one thing I was definitely conscious of was that I think a lot of Black life in the UK isn't necessarily afforded that level of attention and care when written about. I think sometimes we might speak in extremities, if that makes sense. And I was really interested in being like, how about we look at Black communities in the UK with like that breadth of nuance and real study and a real attention to detail, and bring out like the everyday, almost normalness of what communities look like up and down the country. So I was attempting, I guess, to bring that to some of these places, which I think have been undertold in a lot of ways.
Why do you think there is potentially a kind of gulf in the readership for narrative nonfiction in the UK versus America? Because I think, again, you're completely right in that. Like, it feels like that is I won't say dominant, but it's a very kind of present mode of literature in America, and has been even before the kind of new journalism stuff. Do you think there's something, is there something in that? Do you think that we have a reticence here in the UK to read and engage with work of that kind?
Yeah, I think there's two things. I think there's one that is really macro, quite meta, and then there's another one which is like quite structural. So I think on the structural level, I guess America is bigger than the UK. The readership is bigger than the UK. The media platforms are bigger than the UK. So I guess there's money that can afford that. There are rates that you can pay to allow somebody to go and research for 4 or 5 months, 6 months to write like 4,000 word piece. I know writers in America who make a living off doing that. Essentially, they might write 4 pieces a year, 5 pieces a year, and they can do that. Whereas obviously in the UK, the budgets are a lot smaller, and that just physically makes it more difficult to go off and write and do those pieces. There are obviously a few platforms that do that, like the Financial Times have a long read section, and I write for the Guardian long reads myself. And I guess those are kind of like almost unicorns in terms of the general media landscape. I think the other thing, which I believe, I haven't like verified this at all, but my idea is that I think America, because America is such a young country, I think everything they do, they are storytelling. They're attempting to craft a narrative about what the country is. And I think in a lot of ways, they're still figuring it out, if that makes sense. So I think you see it obviously in narrative nonfiction, in their long form journalism. They have a real tradition of that, where journalists are going all across the country to essentially try and define like what is the American story and what does it mean to be American. But that seeps into all other forms of their media too, like of course Hollywood, which I guess is maybe more of a project initially. Even if you look at like American stand-up comedians, some of my favorite stand-up comedians, and you look at like their legendary stand-up comedy sets, they are essentially they're essentially telling a story about a specific place or a specific time period in US history, from Eddie Murphy to Chris Rock to Dave Chappelle. You look at their classic stand-up sets, that is essentially what they're doing. So I think you find it in every form of American media. There is like this need and this hunger to tell and craft a narrative about a country that is quite young. And I think obviously Britain being a much older country, the story of Britain is a lot more set, and the national story of Britain, even though I think it's slightly changing, is I guess a lot more accepted in a way. Like there's a rooted class system. There has been a monarchy for however long. All of these things we already know. So I feel like there's sometimes less of a hunger to talk about and explore like what is the idea and image of Britain today, which it still is a strange thing because, as I said, I mentioned sports writing and how American sports writing does that so well. And obviously Britain's relationship with sports is fascinating. Like they are such, from football to cricket to rugby, like they're sports that are such bastions of community and such rich territories for storytelling. But I don't think you still don't see it as much, which surprises me a little bit.
Yeah, you don't. And I'll save my thoughts on that for another time beyond this podcast. But yeah, 100%. I want to talk then about national stories. I think, do you see your book acting almost as a kind of, and again, I don't want to put words into anyone's mouth, so please tell me if this seems too strong or is a misreading or a misinterpretation. Do you potentially then see your book as a kind of corrective to other kind of cultural music stories around the mid 20th century to the present day in Britain? You know, does it feel like a corrective to that? Like you're telling a very different story to the received story of British pop culture, which tends to go light entertainment, into the Beatles, into punk, into rave, and it vanishes, you know. Is that something that you were conscious of when you were putting this book together, that it was telling a different national story? Yeah,
I would say not a corrective, more so an addition, I would say, to the national story in that sense. Because something I was very conscious of, and I've been conscious of my entire life, is that a lot of the musicians and the music that I was speaking about, obviously I speak about it historically and not just in a contemporary sense. So I go back to sound system culture in the 60s and then through to like So Solid Crew in the late 90s and the early 2000s. But one thing that always struck me was that when we talk about, on a national level, people talk about the country's most impactful musicians and whatnot, a lot of British rappers would be completely left out of the picture, even though they are making some of the most engaging and transformative and just popular music for like the past 15, 20 years. Like you go to cities all across the UK and these musicians are some of those popular artists in those places, and they had been, and I think they'd kind of been left out of the national story in that way when you think about what the defining musicians of the past 50 years. Of course, like the Beatles and punk and David Bowie and all of these artists are part of that, but then especially in this time period, these artists are a part of that too. Before we get to like Stormzy and Dave, who have erupted into national consciousness, there were artists who were hugely popular all across these cities, and that would never be reflected, I guess, on a more mainstream level. And I remember Googling one time, which was like quite almost a small motivation behind the book, was Googling most famous artists in South London. And all the pieces you would read, of course, would say like David Bowie and whatnot, but you would never actually hear about the artists whose music really had a stranglehold and a real hold on the region for like the past 20 years. You wouldn't hear about somebody like Giggs, who to this day, I'm sure Giggs song, I've been at places where Giggs songs are played at birthdays, christenings, weddings. One of the most popular artists coming from South London in the past 20 years, but that wouldn't necessarily be reflected on a national level. So I guess for me, the book was about adding this music into like a more national archive, if that makes sense, to, I guess, tell the history of it, but to also show how deep rooted it is, and to say that this time period where where British rap is hugely commercial and hugely successful, that it doesn't start from there, and that wasn't necessarily an accident or a flash in the pan. That was the result of 50, 60, 70 years of music bubbling in these different working class areas across the UK.
Fantastic, thank you. I want to delve into the areas that you write about in a bit more detail in a second. But firstly, could you maybe talk me through how this book came into being in a very literal way? How did you go from the initial idea to having it signed, to going into the draft stage, to manuscript? Because I've got friends of mine who also work in the kind of narrative nonfiction space, and there's something so exciting to me about having those initial discussions in the pub or in a coffee shop or on a walk where they'll say, I've got the idea. Something has come and they're like, this is going to be the book or the next book. And then seeing the years of work, and then suddenly, I'm lucky enough to have the proof, or it's in the bookshop. What was your story on that front?
Interesting. So yeah, long journey. But so initially, the first thing I did was had started to write some pieces that I guess were a bit more reflective of what I'd want to write as a book. And these were like longer form pieces, and I'd started to write a few essays and whatnot. But then I think the biggest thing for me initially was I just started to go out and do the reporting by myself, before a book deal, before an agent, before any of that. I just started reaching out to individuals so there's a guy in the book, Despa, whose book kind of anchors the spine of the West Midlands story. And I knew Despa quite well already. So I explained like the idea of a book I had to him, that I want to go across the UK and tell like these individual stories, but then hopefully like these individual stories will like weave together into something that is more of a national portrait in that way. And he was game. So I just started by hanging out with him for like hours and hours and hours on end to hear like his life story and to hear the moments and the memories that had made him. And he drove me around some of the places that were influential to him, and he let me I think the first time we did the official interview was his kids were on some holiday from school, so his kids were in the back, and I just kind of spent the day with all of them. And that was like what I was looking to do, because journalism, as you know, is great, but you might have an hour with a musician, 45 minutes with a musician. And I knew I wanted to do something a lot longer and to write in a bit of a richer way. So that was how I started. And then after that, I went down the traditional route of, I literally Googled like, how do you get a book deal, essentially? Like that's what I did. So and I found this website, Jericho Writers, and that they had a few articles that would essentially break down the entire process to you. So they'd be like, first you need to get an agent, and this is how you get an agent. So I wrote like a proposal up, and in the proposal I'd written up this mini chapter that was constructed around Despa, and sent it out to a few agents. I met my agent through one of those reach out emails and kind of explained to her the book, and she really understood the book and what it could be too. And then together we worked on a proposal, which was, I guess, a more official proposal. And then the agency and her sent it out to a few publishers. And then I ended up going with Faber and Faber as my publisher. And that was off the back of meeting my then who became an editor, Alexa von Hirschberg, and she was just amazing. Her level of her skill, her thoughts about like what the book could be and how I could push myself as a writer were all like fascinating to me. So I ended up going with Faber, and that was like the traditional route. And then through then, that's I guess when the real work started, was then actually going out and deciding how do I want to tell this story and who are the people I want to have as part of this story too. So it was a lot of reading about the actual bones of story structure, and there are great books on that. There's John McPhee from the New Yorker has written a great book on structure, so I read a lot of those. But I started to essentially go out and doing the reporting, spending hours and hours and hours with people in these 3 different regions without necessarily a remit. And we wouldn't talk about anything specific. I'd meet someone and we'd spend like 8 hours talking about everything from music to family to what it's like to grow up in Cardiff to immigration to all of these things. And then so that was I guess the art of hanging out is what a lot of people call it. So I was kind of just doing that for about 4 or 5 years, just hanging out with people consistently till I feel like I had enough information to tell the wider story of the book.
And I hate to invoke this in late 2024, but now I have a kind of clearer understanding of the timescale you were working on. Did the pandemic have any kind of major impact on your ability to report in person, to put in, as you say, the kind of the hours into the art of hanging out? Was there any impact on that front?
Yeah, huge. So I signed my book deal in December 2019. So I was like, okay, 2020, I'm just going to get on the road and just report for that year. And then I'll write the book the year after. And then, yeah, everything will be great. So of course, like March 2020 comes and yeah, lockdown, everybody's at home. So I couldn't actually go out and do any of the reporting. I'd done a little bit before that, but nowhere near enough. So I was kind of just trapped at home the same as everybody else was. But so that put a real rupture into just the timeline of the book and like when it was meant to be handed over, so it got delayed. But in truth, I think that delay was probably a good thing. I think I spent a lot of that time period just learning and reading about craft, and I think the book wouldn't have come out in this way. I don't think I even had the tools to express myself in the way I would have wanted to at that time period without going on that journey of learning. So there was a book I read called The New Nonfiction, the new journalism, which was essentially it's interviews with about 22 different authors who have written creative nonfiction, and they really specifically break down like craft, like reporting, story structure, narrative, prose. And I read that book, highlighted that book, typed that book out, and I feel like I've really got a true understanding of what it was I was trying to do, but then equipped myself with the tools to be able to do that. A lot of the most foundational books I read came in that 2020, the Art of Service of David Finkel, the book with Catherine Boo, a lot of the American sports writing, Gary Smith. Like I was just inhaling it because there was nothing else to do. And that was really useful, because then when I finally sat down to write, I felt like equipped and knowledgeable of what I actually wanted, with the story I wanted to pull out and how I would actually tell that story.
How much did that story change over those years, and how open were you as a writer to kind of adapting to that? You know, were you if this was the case, if things did change, and I'm not thinking here necessarily about kind of structural changes, but more kind of, I guess, ideas-based things. In general, are you kind of open to that? You know, do you like these almost kind of happy accidents in reporting? And, you know, we've all been there as kind of journalists, like you will interview someone, maybe you've got an idea of where the piece will lead to, and then they'll say something that sends you in a totally different direction and you have to rethink things. Is that something that you find kind of energizing and exciting as a writer?
Yeah, it changed a lot. And I think it was something I had to become more flexible to. At the start, the idea was just to literally just tell these 8 or 9 stories and that's it. It wasn't going to be like a wider social history. There wasn't going to be a lot of politics in there. But by the process of reporting, I would see like how you couldn't remove the music and the lives from the politics that shaped the communities that they live in. So, for example, in Wales, in Cardiff, I spoke to a lot of people who were from the working class areas of like southern Cardiff. They called it like the southern arc of unemployment at the time in the early 2000s. So, but I would speak to everyone and people would say like, essentially a story would emerge about deindustrialization. So it wasn't just about music. It wasn't just about these specific journeys they'd been on. There was a wider hovering thing about they were the generation who grew up after deindustrialization, and that had affected almost everything in the city, if that makes sense. Like Cardiff being a port city, a big mining, and then shipping out all across the world from like the valleys, the mining, the iron would come in from the valleys and they'd ship out all across the world. So that then being dismantled and the factories being dismantled across Cardiff had changed the city massively and had changed the lives and the landscapes of the young generation who were growing up there. So it almost felt I couldn't leave that out of the story because it was such a big part of it. So I was just trying to find a way to, how do I tell that in a way that is still evocative and doesn't just read like a retelling of facts. So to try and show like how it intermingles with the lives of the musicians who were growing up in that time period. So I think that was a big change. And I realized that as I was going on, that was happening in all of these different regions. It happened in the West Midlands, of course, like big history of factories and whatnot after the war, during the war, after the war, the industrialization again. And so seeing how connected the genres were to actual British history wasn't something I necessarily anticipated, because I'd always thought about them almost in a silo that existed away from the national story. And then you start to do research and you realize like how connected it is to the events that have gone on in the country over the past 40, 50, 60 years. So that was probably the biggest change. And then it was figuring out how do I incorporate that into without the lives getting lost amongst the history.
And I think the lives that leads me to ask kind of something that really struck me as a reader with this was it's how you honed in on individuals like Despa, like Cadet, who are names that might not be, they're not kind of household names around the UK. Was it integral to you to tell those kind of stories as opposed to another kind of history of Black British music that maybe kind of, you know, centralizes someone like Giggs, for example? You know, characters like individuals, sorry, like Giggs and Skepta kind of, they circled the edges of the book. They're present, and they become increasingly present towards the end of the book as we reach the present day, where kind of grime and UK rap have this huge commercial moment and become an indelible part of a kind of broader pop culture in the UK. But was it important to you to kind of focus on kind of lesser known names and lesser known stories?
Yeah, definitely. That was very intentional. I think having like all of the musicians you've named, I've like because I've been interviewing musicians for so long and interviewing British rappers and MCs for so long, so I'd had all of that archive there. And when I think about the impact of the music, one thing that really stood out to me was that, yes, it's great that the music is commercially successful and it's on Glastonbury and magazine covers and the Brit Awards and all of this stuff. But when I was thinking about the impact that the music I've seen have in almost an unseen way, I was interested in exploring that. Like, how does it shape someone's day-to-day life who maybe doesn't have that level of fame? And there are hundreds and hundreds of stories of musicians who aren't as commercially popular, but have still been impacted by the music in that really visceral way. And so I wanted to tell some of those stories, which showcased the influence and like the hovering effect that rap and grime has on people who participate, because it's not as if, I guess it's one of those genres where everybody participates. Like in school, you're in school, everybody participates. It's only a handful of people who are going on to actually make livelihoods, but everybody participates in it. So I was interested in exploring those stories. So someone like Desperate, for example, he, on the face of it, I guess his story is about helping build the infrastructure of grime and rap in the West Midlands. But then the real undercurrent of the story is about him coming from quite a traumatic background, and music is a vessel for him to essentially find new family and build family again. And I was interested in exploring that, like those really personal anecdotes that you might not, that are hard to see on an album or hear on an album, but are really transformative and speak to, I guess, like a lot of the human condition and a lot of what we're all looking for, which is like community, connection, purpose, love. How was the music a vessel for finding and experiencing those things in all of these different places across the UK?
Fantastic. I've got a few more. You've kind of, I want to kind of circle back to that phrase of the art of hanging out, which I think really does like, and is not just a wonderful phrase, but I think really elucidates my reading of the book now. You know, how did you build those relationships in the first place with the kind of the subjects of the book? Because I don't want to describe them as characters. They are still subjects. They're individuals with stories that you're telling and relaying. But how did you build those relationships? And what is your approach in general to that stuff? How do you engender a sense of connectivity and trust with the subject?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was rooted in just showing up, if that makes sense, continually, like consistency. So as I said, it was like a 5-year period of interviewing people. And the first interaction, I said, my first interactions with a lot of people lasted like 6, 7, 8 hours. We'd spend the entire day together. And then I'd come back maybe 2 weeks later or a month later, and I'd do the same again. And I'd continue to do the same, just start hanging out, and to the point where we knew it wasn't necessarily an interview in that sense. It was more just a wide-ranging conversation about anything and everything. Of course, music was still going to be a big focus of the conversations too. So in terms of hanging out, it was just trying to be present as much as possible and trying to make people comfortable as well, to feel like they can speak about some quite personal things, some quite introspective things, some quite traumatic things, and to, I guess, show that level of care that they feel that they can trust me when sharing some of that information. So I think that was a lot of it, and was explaining, I guess, like my intentions. I talk about my life to a lot of the people I was speaking to as well, because it was like a two-way thing. It wasn't just, I'm just hearing this information from you. It was like, I have things to share as well. So a lot of it was that, essentially. I'd take my iPhone and I'd just put my iPhone on record for the day, and then we just roll through wherever. In one of the chapters, I go to the South Wales Valleys with an artist called Luke, and we start in Cardiff, just hanging out at his place, and then he drives me back to the South Wales Valleys where he's from, Neef, Port Talbot, and drove all through the day. We drove around like where he went to school, drove around like the factories and the steelworks and whatnot, and we just talk about what his experiences were. So yeah, the art of hanging out was something I got from a journalist, Ellie Saslaw, who at the time was at the Washington Post. I think he's at the New York Times now, but he essentially would do these beautiful pieces of just hanging around around with individuals for a day or 2 days or 3 days or 4 days or 5 days, however long, and their stories would be written really personally, but they'd also be representative of like a wider social or political issue. So it might be a family that's struggling with homelessness, and then that story ladders up into a wider story about the state of homelessness in a specific state in America. But you can only get to the true, authentic version of somebody by just putting in the hours, essentially. And a lot of it was that a lot of trains to Cardiff and a lot of trains to Birmingham and to Coventry, and literally just being there for sometimes days and days and days on end, and then come back into it again.
Similarly, in the way that I think, we've discussed the intention behind building the book around, I guess, lesser known artists. How intentional was it that you ended up exploring in real depth very specific sections of South London, South Wales, specifically Cardiff, and then the West Midlands? Again, was that an intentional thing of not wanting to tell a story focused around Liverpool and Manchester, for example? Were you trying to do something with that, saying, actually, there are myriad stories across Britain to tell, let's maybe gravitate towards lesser told ones?
Yeah, I think I don't see my book as like, I never saw it, and I don't see it as like a definitive story or definitive history of the genres. It's just an addition of a certain amount of stories, and then people can tell other ones. So my thinking was I was led by the stories mainly, like the lives of the individuals I was speaking to. So in Birmingham, obviously with Desper being the main spot, that was the very first story I uncovered. And so I knew Birmingham and the wider West Midlands was going to be part of that. And then I knew I wanted to talk about the West Midlands as well, because people associate the music with London specifically, but I knew the West Midlands has the same history of immigration, the same history of the Windrush arriving into the area, the same influence of West African immigrants that come after, the same history of sound system cultures, the same genealogy of music from jungle to garage to grime and to drill. So I wanted to showcase that isn't just a London specific story. This was a story that was happening all across the country. And then in London, I think a lot of people associate the music with East London. And I think there are like 3 or 4 books now on East London. So I was like, I don't really have much else to say about that. I think it's already been said. So I wanted to look at South London more specifically. And then after that, I knew that I wanted to talk about life outside of England, and I wanted to write about Britain as a whole. So I knew I had to leave England essentially. So I tried a few places. I tried Glasgow, and stories weren't quite right. And so I stumbled on the stories in Wales, and once I found the stories there, that was like, I was kind of locked in, if that makes sense. I think probably some of the most interesting stories of the book about what is life like for people who aren't career musicians. Essentially, you start as a teenager, the Ashford Boys, they get signed. Phil, who's the main member, they get signed to Sony Music. They're touring across Europe, but then after that, things fall apart and they go back to ordinary lives. Like one of them, he becomes like a milkman delivering commercial milk across South Wales. Phil works in like a factory for a little bit. So it kind of shows like how a lot of musicians recede back into everyday life. And I was interested in capturing that part of the book, in capturing that part of the story and that part of music and how music exists for people. It isn't just like this euphoric, meteoric rise. I was interested in showing that too.
Fantastic. Thank you. I have 2 more questions left. One is, the book starts with an epigraph from Kano. I always wonder about this. Is it fun or really daunting to think of what the epigraph for a non-fiction book should be? Because it's always really interesting to think about where this has come from, what role it plays in the book, and I think they can really frame the reader's perception of what is to come. So how did you land on that quote, and how do you feel about them in general?
Well, yeah, Kano is my favourite musician, I would say. And funny enough, obviously, we were talking about the text that influenced the book. Music was obviously a huge influence as well. And his albums, Made in the Manor and Hoodies All Summer, were just as influential in writing the book as any text was. I feel like they are kind of social histories told through a personal lens. Like he's telling his story of growing up in East London, but you hear a wider story about the descendants of the Windrush generation, the impact of the Windrush generation, the politics that shaped the music and that shaped him, youth violence, all of these things. So that was like a blueprint and a template for me, him as a musician. And I would listen to it. There were a lot of albums I would listen to whilst traveling the country, and his were probably the most popular because I feel like they were very evocative in how he writes, and his like style of writing, when I talk about like rhythm and cadence and poetry, but bringing out the personal as well, like he fits that to a T. So I kind of just think of him as one of the greatest writers in the UK, regardless of genre. So when it came to the epigraph, I was excited about the epigraph because as you said, they really do set the tone. So I was excited for what would I want to say that feels like it captures the essence of the book and which musicians speak to that. And then, so the epigraph is from a song called Seashells in East by Kano, where he says, do or die, the manor throwing bricks at glass ceilings, do or die, he who dreams of open eyes is alive. And I feel like that captured like the essence of the story. People throwing bricks at glass ceilings, essentially trying to crack into an industry that had been so hostile to the music, and people weren't able to make a livelihood for the music, but it speaks to resistance as well. And the idea of dreamers, I feel like that was such a big part of it. Like a lot of these people I've been speaking about were just wildly ambitious and were dreaming of things outside of what their current circumstances had maybe facilitated them for. Like, as I said, a lot of traumatic backgrounds, family backgrounds, but even like their region, like what people were doing musically, they were really trying to push the boundaries of that. And I feel like that epigraph summed that up quite perfectly. Probably the most daunting thing was trying to get it over the line, like get to use that, because I know I didn't realize until I was going through the epigraph process that I guess musicians tend to charge like a lot of money for you to use their stuff. But I guess I'd interviewed Kano a few times and I've got a good relationship with his manager, so they kind of allowed me to use it for free, which was really nice. But there was a moment I was like, oh, when I spoke to Faber about it, they were like, do you know how much musicians charge? But thankfully we were right.
I'm glad you actually brought up the word dream. So I do have one actual question around the book, and then I'll end with a slightly more fun one. Not that this isn't fun at all, obviously, you know what I mean? Dreams is, you know, there is a whole section of this book entitled The British Dream. The word dream pops up so often in the text. It's really interesting and fascinating that it's your subjects use that word. You think about things using that word and that as a kind of metaphorical underpinning for what is going on here. Again, was that a very conscious thing on your part, or was it one of those happy accidents that comes about when you're spending prolonged amounts of time with subjects and certain words pop up and then ideas flow from that and you think, oh, maybe there is a kind of structural underpinning to the book as a result of this?
That's really interesting, actually, because I hadn't actually thought about how often the word dream comes up.
Somewhere in here, I've got a Post-it note that says, like, wow, the word dreams is often in here.
Interesting. Yeah, I did not realize that. That's so interesting. But the idea, as you said, there's a section, I think it's section 3 called The British Dream. And that was very intentional because hip hop in general is tied to the American dream. Like that is the essential, like whether the American dream is a fallacy, which it is in a lot of ways, but the idea of that you can make something and turn something into turn nothing into something, essentially, like, is the rootings of hip hop. Like people remixing and breaking apart old records to create new music, essentially. And then a lot of the musicians, their life stories, I guess they are American, bears that out, and they're speaking to that idea of like rags to riches. All of that is baked into the music, but baked into American society more broadly. And I was interested, like, what does that look like in a British sense? Because they are making the same type of music, even though stylistically it's different and musically it sounds a bit different, but at its essence, these genres are brothers, if that makes sense. So I was interested in exploring, what does the British dream look like? Is there one? And I think that's something that always also struck me, was that I realized that one way the music had maybe reflected a change in British society was that, I guess, as we've said, Britain, like a much older country, and there isn't that necessarily like wild ambition that you see when you go to America or you consume American stories and whatnot. But I think because a lot of the people who partake in the music are like either immigrants themselves or sons and daughters of immigrants, I feel like that arrived. I'd even see that within myself. Like my parents are both not born here. They're both, one from Cameroon, one from Nigeria. Is that when you have people who've moved to an entirely different continent to set up life in a new space, I think like that naturally like threads like sometimes like an ambition or a hunger or almost like a wide-eyedness about what you can do in the world. And I started to see that within the music, because the music, when you pair it against like a lot of other British genres like punk and whatnot, the ideals expressed are like kind of wildly different. They're the same but wildly different. Like the ambition and the hunger in British rap and grime isn't something we've necessarily seen in British music before. Like the level of aspiration that people talk with kind of sits outside, I guess, the DNA of British society in that way. And I think the music was kind of a reflection of like the communities that birthed it. And I think because a lot of people have come from immigrant backgrounds, but then secondly, because a lot of it is hip hop rooted and a lot of influence from hip hop and American society more broadly, I feel like that is also where like a lot of that fierce hunger and ambition and drive came from too. And a lot of the people in the book would talk about their early influences would be American, like Despa. He talks about like Master P, who ran this legendary record label in America in the 90s. Essentially, like a lot of people drawing from those influences and then trying to put them into their own lives. So I was interested in exploring like, what does the British dream look like in that sense? But then on a flip point, also looking at, because I guess the book is about a lot of small victories and small losses that you don't necessarily see when thinking about the wider narrative of the music. I was interested in exploring the British dream in that sense as well. Like, what does it look like on the smallest scale? Like, and I think a lot of the stories do reflect that essentially.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I was going to end by asking you who your favourite MC is. You've established it's Kano. So I'm going to ask one that is maybe a bit fluffy, but go with me, given that this is a podcast for people who are writers, people who are aspiring writers, people who want to just know more about the ins and outs of what it takes to be a writer and live as a writer in the world. It's music related. When you're writing, do you listen to music? And if so, what do you listen to?
Yeah, I feel like this is the most divisive question for writers, but
right?
I can never listen to music whilst writing. I've tried it once and it just doesn't work for me. I just need pure silence essentially. So I don't listen to music. But what I do is before writing if I know I'm writing on a specific day, I have playlists that I feel like reflect the mood of what I'm trying to capture, if that makes sense. So for this book, for every section, for South London, for West Midlands, for South Wales, I had a playlist that reflected the mood that I was trying to evoke in the prose, if that makes sense. And it might not be music from those regions. It was just music that spoke to a particular feeling and a particular sense of loss or a sense of hope or a sense of optimism or a sense of adolescence. I have music that I'll listen to that speaks to that specifically. I'll listen to that over and over again. And then that I feel like will kind of like fill up my tank almost like creatively. And then I'm ready to like pull out those emotions onto the page. So yeah.
That's lovely. What a nice way to end it. We've got to an hour exactly as well. I just want to say a massive, massive thank you for your time today. Yeah, it's been a really enjoyable conversation. So just a huge thank you.
No, thank you for your time too. I really, really enjoyed it.
No problem.
A heartfelt thank you to Aniefiok Ekpoudom and Josh Baines for sharing their time and insights with us. As always, if you have any questions or you want to get in touch, you can find us on Blue Sky and Instagram at Writers Centre. We're also on Facebook, and you can sign up for the NCW newsletter at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk to stay updated on all our latest news and events. As a UK registered charity, our work is made possible thanks to the generosity of supporters like you. If you'd like to contribute, please visit the Support Us page on our website. Every donation helps us continue inspiring and supporting writers. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and don't forget to leave a rating and a review. Your support helps other writers to find us. Thank you for tuning in, keep writing, and I'll see you on the next episode.